All right, so thank you for taking part in the 2022 Diverse U, celebrating 50 years of Title IX. Diverse U is a celebration of diversity. I'm sure we'll all find out what we learned by attending these sessions, but first, a few grounds. It's an important student-led program, creates learning spaces where people from various disciplines can facilitate discussions in an engaging academic setting. Diverse U is an opportunity to engage in civic discourse and dialogue through listening and learning. The ground rules are in place to assist our presenters in maintaining dignity and respect in those spaces. Here's the guidelines. Guideline 1, communicate direct personal experience and not secondhand experiences. In doing so, we rely on I statements like, I was affected by an incident where, and I know in my life I experienced. Guideline 2, speak for yourself, not as a representative of the group or any other person. Along the same idea, do not single anyone out to be an expert in order to speak on behalf of the group. Guideline 3, if you do wish to reference studies outside of your own experience, we invite you to cite academic studies collected from various academic journals and databases available through the Mansfield Library. 4, be respectful and courteous throughout each presentation, whether you agree with the presenter or not. Our central mission here is civil discourse. Be mindful of the amount of space you're taking up and allow others to share the dialogue. You all have plenty of space, by the way. You can speak as long as you want. Be mindful that many of the presenters are in a place of vulnerability due to the personal nature of each topic. As an institute of higher learning, we depend on the student and academic code and student code of conduct to ensure each presenter is treated with dignity and respect. And then active listening is more than hearing expressed in our presence in the room. Based on this factor, we ask that while we're in this learning space, you silence your phone. If you do need to talk or text, we ask that you respectfully step outside of the meeting space. There you have it, relatively simple guidelines and expectations. Ours should hopefully not be terribly controversial, but obviously if there is any controversy, feel free to speak up. I encourage this is something it's totally fine. The things that I do cite, I do have references and things like that. So there is things that we talked about. So there is that. It's at the very end, but I do try to cite them along as well. So anyway, so the topic of our talk is removing the cloak of invisibility with diversity in gaming and eSports. So we're kind of talking about two things. So Cale and I are going to be going back and forth about basically game development, game design, and how that fits in with eSports and actually games. Okay, so I'm from the School of Visual Media Arts. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm also the director of eSports and the College of Arts and Media director of Access, Equity, and Inclusion. So what that means is I have 3 jobs, but really I'm supposed to really have just one job, but I have 2 jobs and I love them all. So.
And I'm Cale, Patenaude. My pronouns he, him, and I'm director of gaming dev, which is downstairs on the 2nd floor, and I'm also the assistant director for eSports. So I have 2 jobs.
One quick request: can you guys speak a little bit louder because of the fan?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, so I always like to start any presentation off with not only our land acknowledgement to say that we acknowledge that we're in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. Today, we honor the path they've always shown us and caring for this place for generations to come. But this is not just an acknowledgement, but also a way to say thank you and to say this is an appreciation for, we wouldn't be here otherwise. So for me, these statements go beyond just acknowledging. It's always about like, no, this is a true gratefulness in being here in this place. I wouldn't be here otherwise. So that's why I like to have this here. I like to kind of augment it a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of a historical perspectives of kind of gaming and sports, and then we're going to also talk about what's currently happening in the space, and then maybe like what are some futuristic things that we could do to like kind of keep going, right? Because we're talking about this as a different medium of action that maybe people don't necessarily think about when they're thinking about how do we create visibility, because that's what it's all about. For us, it's always about visibility. So historically, if you think about games, you don't probably play games, I hope, at some level. Maybe you play with your family. Maybe you play Monopoly or you play card games, things like that, right? And it helped languages of communication. I can only speak for my family, of course, but in my family, we played games and we talk and laugh, and it wasn't as intimidating necessarily as my mom saying, hey, how was your day? Tell me about what happened in your day. And as a young man, I'd say, it's fine. But playing games, we just start talking. It's more natural, right? And so it kind of created this familial connection, as well as it created some memorable moments, good and bad, right? Like throwing cards or whatever, right? Not always. But it also became educational pathways. So like in my family now, it was ways to help our kids learn how to count or read or any of those things in kind of a less like specific educational, like we're going to sit down and you're going to learn your ABCs or you're going to learn your counting. It's more fun, right? Because you're actually have a purpose. So that's really what it comes down to. It's just fun. So what happened though, is we kind of take this like side path of saying historically, video games came around and through marketing or through different mediums, all of a sudden, like it has this negative impact that has persisted for decades, right? This idea of like, well, now you're not social, or you're socially inept, or all these other negative stereotypes that are associated with it, along with making it a very male-dominated place, which if you look through history, especially if you look through television, what was happening is you're looking at spaces where they say, hey, come play a video game if you're a young boy, right? They literally say, here's the console or here's the platform for boys, showing boys playing. Whereas you have girls playing with Barbie dolls or things like that. So you have less of this feeling like, well, anybody can play, right? So then that goes away. And then to make it worse, then it starts talking about like, there's all these articles, whether it's from various publications, like mainstream publications, and or even elected officials saying like games are causing violence, causing aggression. There is an aggression side to it, but there isn't always this path of like, what does that really look like? Was it actually even studied? And it wasn't actually studied, which is the crazy part. Some studies were happening, particularly talking about aggression, but more of the realm of like, yes, it raises your heart rate. Yes, it raises your stimuli, but it doesn't necessarily make you violent per se. And then of course, there's this preconceived notion of, well, you're just gonna have unhealthy behaviors, right? Like you're gonna eat poorly, you're gonna drink a bunch of Mountain Dew, and then just sit around and be like a slump, right? So these are some of the historical things that have gone into this and has fed into kind of these negative stereotypes. But why does it matter? Why do these things all matter? Because right now, if we look at 2022, worldwide, we have 3 billion gamers. That's saying there's 3 billion people playing at least 1 hour a day. That's a lot of people playing games, which are like, what? This is nuts, right? And they project, 3.2, 3.3 in the next couple of years. My supposition is it's going to be much greater than that. Why? Because we're going to be looking at mobile games way more. We're going to be looking at just more mediums that we can't even imagine right now, whether it's virtual reality, augmented reality, things like that. Those games keep coming at such an exponential rate. We're going to start seeing things like just explode, right? Even over COVID, if you look at 2020, to go from 2.8 billion to 3.09 billion in such a short period of time like that, that's nuts, right? And that's something that was, it just exponentially grew because of that.
And I think to kind of go off of that, if you look at the markets for games, you see where the developers are looking and what they're looking at, and you're looking at those populations that either were inaccessible to games or are now starting to feed into them. And one of the big ones I always look at are like the East Asian markets, the Chinas, the Indias, the stuff like that are now starting to receive this technology that they didn't really have access to, or maybe had very limited access to, and now all of a sudden they're starting to gain more access to it, and all of a sudden you're seeing a huge just surplus of gamers, and especially within the Chinese market, they are primarily mobile gamers. They are probably the most they're the highest consumers of mobile games out of anyone. There's no comparison. I don't have the direct statistic off the top of my head, but I know that's a big thing, and that's when you look at some of these developers, they're all of a sudden releasing all these mobile games. You're like, why the heck is Blizzard and all these people releasing these mobile games? Like, why don't they just released or normal, it's because they're targeting these audiences that have a surplus of gamers that have a lack of genres accessible to them. And you're starting to see that surplus of gamers.
Right. And anecdotally, I can tell you, playing the games I play mobile, it's almost primarily East Asian players that I'm playing against. And they don't just beat me, they like crush me, right? And so you're like, you're really good at this, right? Whether it's PUBG or Clash, whatever, right? But what's more interesting to me is when we start looking and drilling down into who's making these things, right? If we look at these statistics, if we say, well, who are the people that identify as men who are building games? Primarily, even in 2021, it's gotten better, right, over time, but not really all that much better. But in 2021, 61% are still men. And that means 30% are identifying as women. And then you have 8% identifying as either non-binary, gender fluid, and so forth. And then if you break that down into more of those men and women and non-binary, 71% of them still are white. Okay, and so then you have 11% Asian, Latino, Black, and then unknown. And then you have your indigenous population, right? So it dramatically decreases at this point. So you start thinking to yourself, okay, if that's who's building the games, men and primarily Caucasian men, what do you think is going to happen? Who do you think is playing these games?
But I mean, one thing I think is true about all of this stuff is the socioeconomic aspect of it. So,
Yes.
you know, if you can afford a new iPhone
Yes.
or a piece of technology, if we're talking about mobile gaming, for
Yeah.
instance, not everybody's going to be able to get, you know, the best equipment in their hands where they can do these things. So that in itself is going to limit access of various
No.
groups to things.
You're absolutely right. The socioeconomic side of things play a huge role in it, right? And if we look at this, we say, okay, there's two things on this graph. One, if you look between men and women of who's playing, even though it's 60 to like 30 of who's building them, it's almost 50-50 of who's playing them between who identifies as men and who identifies as women. That's pretty remarkable. That did not happen until just recently. That was within the last couple of years. It used to be like 70-30, if that. Why do you think it became closer to 50-50?
Why did that happen?
Yeah, why is it closer to 50-50 now?
Animal Crossing is good.
Yes. Games like Animal Crossing, Stardew Valley, Minecraft, those are huge, particularly in various demographics, right? And because of that, even Tetris, right? You're starting to play games where a broader audience wants to play. So now you start thinking, wait a minute, it's maybe not all games have to be first-person shooters, or they don't all have to be, you know, these really intensive, what have been traditionally set out to be male-dominated games. We can have other games too, but that also allows people of different demographics to say, I actually want to play all these different games.
How do they suss out these statistics in terms of getting the information about who's who? Because I know just having played games online, I don't know what the actual sex of a person is that's there behind an avatar of some sort. I have no idea. Most of the time, I don't even know how old they are. You know, get my ass kicked by somebody, I find out later they were 14.
Yeah.
You know.
Usually it's self-identification. Like it's census data, somebody's just putting out a survey and then they're just statistically saying this is what we're assuming. Because you're right, because of the anonymity of it, that's what you can't necessarily know unless someone self-identifies.
Also, who has time to play games? I mean, you have to actually have the, again, socioeconomic space in your life to actually play games. I know, like if I was in New York, living in New York, I could be playing a game while I'm on the subway on my way to work or something like that.
Absolutely.
On a mobile game platform.
That's right. On a Switch or on a Steam Deck or something like that, right? So if you look in that, thank you very much. That's what also brings us down to what we're looking at in the graph below, right? If we look at who's actually, if you look at the graph down below, which is a little harder to see, but you can see 73% of our gamers are white. Hence, probably our socioeconomics in the US, right? And access and just time, right? whether it's familial or whatever, right? Or just what, but then you start looking at who it is that's playing. Primarily, the highest percentage is 18 to 34-year-olds. Why is that?
College age, they might be living in dorms, they have the time on
They have the time, they have the money.
Yeah.
Because the people under 18, this is a funny statistic, because the people under 18 primarily play the most percentage-wise. They put in the most time, right? I think about my son, he's 17. He'll play for hours, right? So he'll play more hours per person, right? But they don't have as much money. They have to ask somebody for money, unless they're working or whatever, right?
They also are restricted.
And they're restricted because they have a parent saying, hey, you can't do that.
Yeah.
But at 18 to 34, there's no one telling them. They can just play as long as they want. Hence, they've got the time, the money, and the means, right? So they can actually put all that in it. Whereas it sort of drops off. But you can actually see how it's starting to grow, even in that 35 to 44 and 45 to 54. To me, it's as people start aging and as they played when they were younger, they just keep playing. So that number will continue to grow as well. Plus, they have even more money, right? They just don't have as much time. Okay. So the problem is that historically, minoritized, underrepresented, and marginalized groups, they're not building games because of the exact same thing why they're not playing games. And that's what leads into, if we don't have people representing, then we have people that aren't seen. Like, it's only coming from one point of view, right? So that's part of it. But what we want to start thinking about is like, how do we broaden this, right? So we spoke to this, which is during COVID, multiplayer or online gaming became huge. And there's a reason, right? We were all isolated from each other. So social connection. Even anecdotally, you could say, if you played online, you were still friends with your friends because like you could at least talk, even if you weren't in the same classroom or the same room or the same house or whatever, you could still communicate with each other. So in addition, things like Discord or things like, you know, whether you're still texting or Snapchat or whatever, those kept people connected as well. And then when I say diversity of games, this comes back to what we were talking about, Stardew Valley or, you know, Animal Crossing. Those started being developed, okay? Because they're like, wait a minute, there's a market for it. Because at the end of the day, we live in a capitalist society. So they're like, wait, if we can make more money at this, we're gonna build games like this. So then it starts saying, okay, this also feeds into our mobile game. If people are wandering around on their phone, on the subway or on the bus or on the train or whatever, and they can play a game, and then they're playing, say, like Candy Crush, and they're willing to watch an ad, which, by the way, they will watch an ad over paying for stuff. People are more apt to just watch an ad for 30 seconds, or not even watch the ad, they'll just put it down for 30 seconds and then come back. But somebody's getting paid for that. So they'll do it. So mobile games has helped explode. And then finally, but even more importantly, we have the inception, or at least the growth potential of eSports. And that's where Cale is going to kind of jump over and talk about like what's happened here in this space. Okay.
Yeah. So eSports, as we know, is kind of, it's always been here. If you watch, there's a few Netflix series that talk about the early development of gaming. I can't spacing the series right off the top of my head, but they talk about literally like the beginning, like the Nintendo versus Sega, and they go through this whole arc on Commander, the old, you know, arcade Commander, and how a bunch of high school college students decided to develop like an add-on, and then Pac-Man and the invention of this Pac-Man, and how like this whole explosion of gaming came to be. And something they touch on very early on is eSports. They talk about these big Tetris tournaments that happen. They talk about the Sega Cup. They talk about the Nintendo Cup. But like that's, they talk about it in the sense of we're developing video games and it just is kind of an add-on. But that is essentially eSports. And so you see this very early inception of eSports, but only until recently has it really gained so much traction where it's actually looked at as saying, oh my goodness, like this is a big thing. And, you know, capitalism at work, when people are like, oh my goodness, I can make a ton of money doing this, or we can, as a development company, make a ton of money trying to do this, and so you get this explosion of esports.
Just one second. Do you know what eSports is?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. I always like to ask just in case people don't know, because I was in another session and they didn't even know. So I just wanted to make sure. So great. Thank you.
Yeah, and so that's very good, because I could have just kept rambling about it. So you have this explosion of esports. You have this big entertainment titan that all of a sudden bursts into the scene to say, hey, this is a really entertaining thing for many different people, as we saw from the graph. If you have 3 billion people actively playing games, a percentage that's going to be your audience. And if you can even grasp, 10, 20% of that audience, that's a significant chunk of people that are watching your game. Because obviously it all feeds into it. If people are watching your game, they're more likely to play your game, they're more likely to do that. Then we have the Twitch content creators, which explode through phenomena like that. And, they start playing games, they start getting sponsors, all that kind of stuff. But if you look at Twitch streamers, esports players, all that kind of stuff, you'll notice, again, very similarly to the historical figures, most of them are middle-aged white male, like myself, or younger than me, because I'm kind of aged out at this point, which is another thing we'll touch on later on. So, that's a big thing, is that in the statistic Michael has that's a national statistic. Yeah, so 8.2% of any esport player surveyed that is identify as a woman. And that's a very small statistic if you think about if 8.2% are women, then the other 92% or 91.8% are males. And so you have this, again, big gender gap between male and female populations and non-binary populations.
What platforms are the most lucrative for people out there?
Right.
I know YouTube, there are people who post their wins and they show these things and they get ad revenue from that. And then the ads can be related to what their personality is too. It might be a certain company. If it's a female, then it might be products that are related to that gender. Or for men, it might be some other thing. What's the most lucrative platform for currently?
So right now, Twitch is the most lucrative platform, just because of the accessibility of the platform makes it like you don't need to necessarily be playing games even. Like most people do, like they have so many subsections of like IRL, it's called just chatting, they have, which IRL is in real life. That can be done off your phone. You could do, cooking, you could do art, you could do games. Like that's the big thing about Twitch is Twitch started as just like a gaming platform, but they've expanded into this live content, basically like anything you do that isn't prohibited to, like sex, drugs, and alcohol, you're able to do on Twitch. And that has really allowed it to become kind of, and I would say they probably treat their streamers, while not the best, the best out of the content platforms. Like YouTube has a lot of very strict rules and how they pay their content creators and all that kind of stuff, where Twitch has really tried to at least appear to give stuff back to the content creators. I mean, at the end of the day, I know Twitch and Amazon, they make money off of it. They look to make money off of it, but they seem to at least try to pay their content creators through ad revenues, subbing, all that kind of stuff, and allowing them to get direct donations and that kind of stuff.
And it seems like the people who know about it, but there's a whole, like, in general, people don't know about that.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's not like Facebook or YouTube or even Twitter or something like that that gets all the notoriety about its direct impact on society and also the revenues that are made through those platforms.
And it really, to piggyback off that, it really is like this whole age of influencers and content creators that like it's a whole subsection of marketing and kind of advertisement for a lot of these developers, a lot of even own personal, self-ran businesses, because that's basically like some people make their entire living off of streaming on Twitch, which at that point you're your own business owner at that point, because that is your livelihood, that is how you're making money. And we have this, again, historical stereotype of video games are a waste of time, and we have people who are making probably multi-million dollars off of, well, a very, very, very small subsection of it, you have people making millions of dollars off of Twitch.
And how's the university, can the university plug into that revenue stream in any way? Is it possible? I mean, that's the kind of thing that I keep coming back to is like, there's all this talk in sports about players that are in football or whatever else, traditional sports that I hate, they're making now able probably to be able to make money based on their character and their persona.
Right.
I mean, whatever sport there is. And I'm kind of a believer in that because I feel like they are bringing something to the university too, like some notoriety, recognition, whatever it might be in the team sports.
Yeah, so so we're not bound by the NCAA on none of our players, so we never had to worry about name, image, or likeness kind of issues or things like that. We kind of followed that pathway a little bit, but we never were bound legally.
There's
by
no
that.
contract deals.
So the students are always able to kind of stream on their own and do their things, as long as for us it was always based on, are you a good representative of the university?
Like behavior ones.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So it's always based on our foundational principles, which Cale will talk about in a second, but it really had a lot more to do with that than them profiting. We want them to, like, if they're going to make money, then they should, you know what I mean? If that's a way in which they can make money.
But the university right now does not make any revenue off of eSports,
No.
which is different from like football where
Right.
they make a huge amount
Right.
of money off of it. That's almost
Yes.
type.
Right.
And that's a weird thing to talk about, but it might be something to consider, that the university would be able to get some, I mean, it's the reason that people buy into things like the Grizz or whatever it is.
Right.
There's some revenue that comes in.
Yeah, and so, no, that's always a good one. So, one of the big things we want to talk about is what do we here at the University of Montana's Grizz eSports do differently? Before we kind of go into the slide, one of the big, again, not even a stereotype, I mean, it's really true, is that most programs, whether they be collegiate or professional, they're focused on winning. That's what brings them the money, is winning. And that's always been the mantra, whether it's a traditional sports team or even now esports team, is that when you win, you get money. And so it's always become just this inherent bias in any coach and any program leadership that, like, when I'm building this team, when I'm putting these people out here, I need to make sure I'm putting the best of the best. I spare no expense to headhunt the absolute best because we have to win. And because that's how we get paid, is we win. And so something that Michael really started to focus on, and I got to have the good graces of kind of piggybacking off of, is this idea of what if we tried to do something a little different? What if we tried to not create necessarily a hyper-competitive focused environment, but one that fosters a true community that can then promote competitiveness? And so that comes into, we're foundationally focused on inclusion. One of the big things that we try to do here is make it as inclusive as possible for all different backgrounds. Because at the end of the day, what we find is that it doesn't matter whether it's the color of your skin or how you identify or, where you come from, that you can be just as good as your typical white male gamer. Radical welcome for all. We want to make sure that people are not scared. I mean, there's a reason there's such a high split in male versus female, in people of color versus white, is because those minorities feel threatened or scared by entering the space, because a very typical interaction that happens is you hear the slurs online all the time. Oh, you play a video game like a girl, or oh, you're trash, or whatever it might be, and that becomes incredibly intimidating for our minorities to feel like they can enter the space, when realistically, them entering the space only helps promote health within our community, because again, it creates diversity, it creates strength, it creates competitiveness, all the different things. Because again, if we're not truly trying to identify all areas of talent and expectations, then we're always going to have this like baseline of talent, like this just very static baseline of talent because we're never diversifying. This is a huge one, create an equitable space for all players. You mentioned it earlier, and Michael did with socioeconomics. I mean, at the end of the day, not everyone can afford the best equipment, you know, the best PCs, the best keyboards, headsets, phones, whatever they might be. We want to create that space so you don't have to worry about it. At the end of the day, you come into our training area, you have all the gear you need, you have all the peripherals, and you're ready to play. And there's no, you know, price tag attached to it. You're just there to play. Be inclusive with all that we do. This expands way far outside of esports. You know, Michael always says this, it's become our mantra. We're trying to create citizen gamers. We want everyone to feel included and also promote that health, promote that inclusion to everyone. That again, it does not matter. We want you to be a part of us, even if you're a Stardew Valley gamer or you're a hyper competitive Call of Duty player. Like we want you to be a part of our group, because at the end of the day, I mean, at the end of the day, most college students only have the friends they make on campus or their support structures that they have on campus. 90% of the time, they don't even have their parents because they may live farther away or even in a different state. You know, they lose their built-in support network, and so they have to build a new one now that they've come to campus. And we're just trying to make it that much easier by connecting them with other people who like to game. Promote growth, not perfection. This is a huge one. Again, people design teams to win. We did not. We designed teams to grow. And what that led us to was multiple championships, multiple trophies. It all just came. But at the end of the day, even if we don't have trophies, which we do hanging down in the gaming den, I mean, we would have been fine with it because that's not our core mission. Our core mission is not to win every single championship we walk into. Our core mission is to make sure students succeed at college and get to move on and actually find careers of what they're looking for. Allow each other to be who their true selves. So again, this falls into a lot of our, non-binary, people who are trying to figure out who they are. I mean, a lot of identity searching, soul searching happens at college because, again, you go out of the family circle where they're telling you to be a certain way, or they maybe don't understand, or there's so many different things out there that cause parents to not be able to fully enable their children to be who they are. And it's not necessarily a fault of the parent, even though sometimes it is. It's really that it really, once you gain that freedom to say, wow, you mean I decide my schedule, I decide whether I go to class or not, I get to eat or not, type deal, then all of a sudden it's like you start exploring who you are. And that goes beyond just like, who am I as a person, but how to identify what are my interests, what are my hobbies, what's my sexual orientation. Like it just explodes at that point. You're allowed to actually be. And so what we really try to do is foster that. We don't want anyone to ever feel like they need to hide who they are when they're in our community. See another and focus on community are definitely two hand-in-hand type deals, is that we really want them to connect with one another. I mean, online gaming is that, it's online gaming. You don't have to be in person to game with someone else, but there's such an important thing with being able to sit next to a teammate and then you score that awesome Rocket League goal, and then you like lean over and you're like fist bump and get that fist bump. Like you can't do that online. There's just something incredibly different. I got to experience last night, one of our teams played a really hard series and they ended up winning, and just the elation of being able to like stand up and high five each other, and you hear them screaming and shouting, like you don't get that same just very what's the word, the surge of happiness, that like hormone, or the like
serotonin.
Yeah. You get endorphins with serotonins that just like fire, and you're like just so pumped and ready to go. You get that, but not to the degree of when you actually can be like right next to your teammates and like really get that. And it leads into that focus on community. Is that a lot of our students, this is all they have. And we want to make sure it's the absolute best we can possibly make it for them. And if we're not the community for them, that's fine. We'll help them find the community that is for them. But if your community is us, we're going to make it the best community experience while you're on campus, that's for sure.
So you guys have a sort of collegiate and even high school based notion of levels, like JV and varsity and that kind of thing. How do you determine who's in those areas
Yeah, that's a
with
great question.
your pretty clear level of, we don't care whether you're great. And also this whole thing, like when I first started playing years ago, when my brother-in-law forced me to play on some online gaming stuff, and I was a noob, okay, and I was really considered to be a noob, and I was treated as such. Some people were really cool to me, and others, and they thought that was the best way for me to get up to snuff by treating me like that. And then I was like, oh, I could just go to this website and buy some new armor, then I can just be better,
Right.
or whatever,
Yeah, so that's an amazing question because we get asked this by students all the time, and that's again a barrier of entry that they're afraid of. So we always list it in kind of three primary categories. Number one is communication. Are you willing to communicate with others? Are you willing to step out of your comfort zone and actually try to build an effective team that synergizes well, that communicates well, that shows up to practice on time, that are you willing to be able to talk to each other as teammates, as peers, and say, hey man, what you just said is not really great, that kind of stuff. Hey, you're kind of being toxic. Let's bring it back a little bit. Hey, I don't appreciate the way you're doing that, but also being able to compliment each other on good plays, on good successes, stuff like that. So communication is by far our biggest thing we look at. Our second is dedication. When you have a team of 5 players and one person doesn't show up, the whole team can't do anything. So are you willing to put in the time? Are you willing to give up a little bit of your schedule to commit to something like this? Because again, you're asking anywhere from 1 to 5, 6 people to commit to a time frame. And when one person doesn't show up, it kind of ruins it for the rest. And so dedication is another one. And then we start to kind of look at skill a little bit, because when you do look at skill, there are some things you can glean from it. A few of them are is this person do they actually like to play the game? Or are they doing it a little bit more for fun? What's their level of interest when it comes to their skill? Are they just casually playing? Are they looking for more casual players? Or are they more competitive and they're looking for that competitive environment? And so that way what we can do is build out more synergy amongst teams and really identify less so of you're better than the other players or this team is better than the rest. It's this team is interested in actually being competitive and trying to do maybe a little bit more of a rigorous training schedule, committed to a few more hours than the rest or something like that, where maybe the next team, is more casually. They're hey, we can throw, a couple hours at this here and there, but we're really just looking for fun, maybe a competition here and there. And then truly the dedicated casual players are I just want people to play with. I could care less about anything else.
And that's a good model, right, for what you guys are trying to do with building the builders.
Yeah, right.
Because those kinds of, the builders are teams that you can't build a game on your own.
So, and we've been able to prove that, okay, so in our first year, we had a team, we actually had a couple really good players, but they were sort of toxic. So we asked them to step back and again, look at how do we get you to grow as a person? And that actually helped, right? It wasn't that we kicked them off, right?
No, you could make them the mentors.
Yeah, we say what role could you participate in?
Yeah.
Maybe you have more skill, but not in all areas of which we actually, our value system. We're always thinking about what's our value system. So then this year when we had a team, or last year, I guess, when we had a team that went to nationals, 2 of the 3 had barely even really played. 1 had barely played. And they went to nationals, right? Based on this model of we think you could all be really good if you could become a good team with one another.
It's like the Ender's Game formula.
Yeah,
and that really ties into the promoting growth and just our center values, like Michael said. I mean, one of the Rocket League players on the team that went to nationals, he started out kind of bottom tier. Like you would look at him and say, how is this? You know, if you looked at him when he started, you'd be like, how the heck is this person on a national team? But you look at his growth between then and now, it's exponential, and it all boils back to that idea that we're fostering this community, if we're fostering this support and growth, then there's no telling where student potential actually lies. And so then you all of a sudden see this nationals level Rocket League team that takes the Big Sky that, you know, goes to semis and nationals against other, you know, US teams who are headhunting, buying out contracts, all that kind of stuff, trying to find the best players. And you can even see it within the games themselves, what teams actually have cohesion and what teams are actually like, who have played together, and others who are like, this is their best player, they paid for this player, they got this player in some way, shape, or form, and they're feeding everything into this player because
because that's the traditional model.
Yeah.
Someday maybe they'll look at your model and say, oh wait, this is more successful than just buying people and bringing them in, wasting all this money on coaches.
That's what's been so fascinating is that we have had teams and organizations and universities in particular say like, wait, how are you doing this? How are you able to like get the diversity that you have and have the player base that you have? Like, how are you doing this? Like, we want to do this, right? Because this university is not alone in thinking about how do we be more intentional about DEI. The other programs are trying to do that, but because the model was set such that Cale was saying, we're just going to find the best players. Well, then now they're having to backtrack, right? And one of the things that, you know, we've done, of course, is, you know, focusing on them. So again, this probably goes back to the citizen game, you know, the citizen gamer type of mentality is that gaming with a cause. I've always had this, I've always said it, is that gamers are not just the lazy people that sit in their mom's basements or whatever and trying to, you know, power grind through WoW or how South Park depicted, you know, whatever it is. Like, we are actually gamers that are trying to make an impact within our own community. And I think these are very important statistics to show, is that we actively engage within our community around us and actively, whether it's raise money, be involved, you know, do these different things. I mean, you know, if we were maybe a typical eSports presence on campus, you may not see us here at diversity. Like, we would have just been downstairs gaming or something like that. But we just feel like there's such a holistic approach that when you can get your gamers to give back to the community, that it helps not only solidify the idea that like we do more, you know, with a cause, but then it also helps parents, it helps guardians, it helps those other people who are like, I don't know if my kid should be gaming. It's like, well, yeah, your kid is gaming. That's not all they're doing. Look at all this other impact they're having on their communities. So here's our results so far.
So demographic, I did a survey over our players. These are our primary teams right now with League, Overwatch, Rocket League, and Super Smash Brothers. And I really was looking for what's the diversity? Where do we differentiate in comparison to the previous statistic that you saw at that 8.2% female rate? And so as you can see, League of Legends, 23% of our players identify as female, 15% identify as indigenous. Overwatch 23 is female and 23% defined as non-binary. Rocket League is 70% as people of color, and I'm sorry if that's not the right term, that's all I can really think of when I was putting this together. And then Super Smash Brothers, 18% identify as female. Again, you're seeing this trend, this upward trend, and I would say going from last year's League of Legends team that I was with, it was a male-dominated field. There was no female players. So even going from last year to this year, we're seeing all of a sudden an increase in female participation. We're seeing an increase in our Native American population. You're seeing an increase in Overwatch has always been kind of our crown jewel of diversity. We always want to make a statement about our Overwatch team because they've always been our most diverse team that we've had.
Why do you think that is? What is it about that game?
Characters.
Yeah.
Because of the range of
The
characters.
character base is much more diverse.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have females, people living with a disability. You have got all sorts of different characters.
And I think that is what makes Overwatch very unique, is that there's been actual like developer lore, if you call it, that says these characters that we've developed actually have these things. So I remember a story about Symmetra, and someone wrote the developer, and he's like, oh my gosh, Symmetra has a disability. I have the same disability. And, you know, the developer's like, you're right. Like Symmetra was designed to have a disability. And I can't remember what the disability is off the top of my head, but like, it was some kind of autism or something on the spectrum that was like very prominent and that someone was able to self-identify and say, oh my God, this character is me. And then same with like Tracer. Tracer is written to be a lesbian. And that doesn't happen. You know, we don't talk about those taboo things like, you know, same sex, you know, marriage and all that kind of stuff in gaming. Like, no, we have to stay by the book kind of deal. And Overwatch was one of the first to really kind of bend and almost break that taboo in
Yeah, even you know, like WoW, that was always like monsters and stuff, but it was female and male.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether you were in the Horde or you were in
Yeah, and oftentimes, unfortunately, non-representative of female characters.
Yeah.
Right, over stuff.
yeah,
Overdoing it in so many areas,
Totally.
and men for that matter as
Yeah.
well. So it's not an accurate representation, which we'll
Yeah.
get to. But this, for us, is we feel grateful that we have this kind of representation. We always hope for more, but particularly in a space and a place where we have well over 86% of Caucasian players and our student population, we feel very lucky that this is what we've been able to invite, and they feel comfortable, that everyone feels comfortable playing with them. So,
And are you thinking about onboarding some different games, or are you just waiting for the energy to come from without to say, oh, this game is really getting hot, let's do this one?
It's a little bit of both. We are always open that if players have games that they're interested in doing, that they can build teams and compete. These are primarily titles that we directly support that have active rosters for. The two that aren't up there right now are Apex and Valorant, because we're kind of in and out of rosters and don't have it necessarily like a super solid basis. But I will say for Valorant, we definitely have a way higher percentage. I want to say is closer to the 50-60% female within Valorant. We actually have, I think, 2 males and 4 females that play on Valorant. And 2 of those females are also Native American. And so, you know, we are seeing this explosion of diversity, like of just more diversity within our program every single year. And I think it's, again, something that I believe is on the next slide. Yeah, so I think this is a big thing, is that within our own leadership, 50% of our leaders identify as people of color, 25% identify as females. I think that's huge. You don't see that statistic almost anywhere else. Again, you would see that most leadership is white male, you know. And so being that we start to see a lot of leaders within our own organization, whether they're captains, whether they're game managers, whether they're community leaders, whether they're, you know, organizers in any way, you start seeing that they help open the floodgates for these other groups to come in, because if they see a leader that's, you know, indigenous or, you know, Black, Latino, you know, whatever it might be, they're all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, if this person is in this place, then that means I can have a place. And we start seeing more and more people come. Right?
So our model is such that our students are our leaders. So there's only you know, very few of us as staff people, right? So we have student leadership who are captains, coaches in each of the games that we play. And last year, 7 out of the 10 were either identified as female, non-binary, person of color, and so forth. So we had, and they are voted on by their peers. It's not like we're saying, hey, you should be that, right? Because I'm always very conscientious of tokenism. That doesn't feel good. I don't know if you all have felt that way before, but it doesn't feel great. So it's like, how do we figure out a way in which people can be raised and, again, be visible, and we feel like by their peers, right? So it's based on their characteristics as a person, as a leader, as a communicator, and less about what they look like. It just so happened to be
it doesn't matter how nice I am or how nice Michael is, especially with, ops like with emails and stuff like that, is that we can't necessarily have the same impact of conversation that another female leader may have. And it's not because, again, Michael and I are the nicest people in the world or something like that, but there's just something to be said when you are represented in a leadership role and get to speak to that person and being able to like have that conversation, whether it's, someone in the same skin, background or color, whatever it may be. There's just a significance to having that conversation instead of me sitting down and saying, hey, Julia, I see you're a girl and you want a game. Let's do this. Like there's just something else to be said for there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you had a previous team where you had some toxic members. How did you go about, for members' behaviors, how do you go about identifying those behaviors and then having those conversations?
Yeah. So usually what we do is we identify, is it a pattern or is it just like an outburst, right? I mean, first and foremost, it's never acceptable. If it's really to a point that it's affecting team morale, I'll instantly pull that player, and we just either have to forfeit the match or put a sub in if it gets to that type of level of toxicity. But is this a pattern of reoccurring behavior, or is this the first time we've encountered it, or kind of two different things? One of the things that Michael has always expressed, and I very much embody, is that we want to be a nurturing environment, not a punitive environment. We want to make sure that people have the opportunity to learn, because these are all, for lack of better word, learning moments. If I have an outburst of toxicity and I just get ripped from the team and I'm benched and everything, that's not helping me as a player. Like, why did I do that? Why did I all of a sudden lash out, rip out, whatever it might be? Is there a true reason? Is that just who I am? Like, if that's, we have to identify like what is going on to cause this type of behavior, and then how do we best navigate nurturing it into less toxic behavior, or is it just, maybe we need to find another place for them? And if it's not necessarily within our community, which is kind of the red button scenario, which we never want to get to, we will help them find that community, even though they may not fit within our own. So it comes in the form of, discussions with the student, helping them identify resources that may help them deal with it. We very strongly encourage peer-to-peer interaction, because it can be very intimidating for me to walk up to someone and say, hey, sorry, you really said something weird in a game, and now we're going to talk about it. Like, we try to encourage our own students to handle it, not necessarily themselves, but at least identify it and say, hey, knock it off, because there's so much power within that, and we want to empower our students to feel like they have that type of autonomy and control. But if it really goes beyond that, then it comes to myself, or it comes to another one of our staff members. We have a discussion about it. We figure out where it needs to go, and if it does follow a disciplinary action, we do have a student code of conduct. We also have an athletic code of conduct that we follow. We have steps within that we follow depending on the severity of the situation, whether it comes in the form of a verbal warning, a write-up, a suspension, a forfeit. And truly, we try to tie everything back to the team. So, if someone's being super toxic, we may have to ask the entire team to forfeit. And that is not to necessarily punish the team, but to also say, hey, you're all responsible for each other's actions. You're a team. You're meant to support each other, and also to kind of rein each other in. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of times toxic behavior just stems from ignorance, some other outside factor affecting the person that we may not know of, at least at that point in time. Or it may truly just be that person. Very rarely have I ever encountered a scenario where someone is just truly toxic and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, honestly, a lot of times it has to do with outside influence. They've been in the kind of the outer world
Learned behavior.
They're playing in an open world, right? So they're continually being fed toxicity, because of the anonymity bringing online. And so they're like, this is acceptable behavior. If I want to flame somebody, it's totally fine, right? So they think it's been normalized. right? But it's, for them, this may feel really radically different. And we're saying like, no, we don't do it this way. And that's hard. The code of conduct that Cale's talking about, that's something that we did have legal run through for us. So it's actually a legalized document that we post. We've shared with multiple other universities, say, hey, this is specific to sports. It's not specific to athletics or anything. This is how we do it. So
Do you guys have a similar thing like in football or any of these places after the game or at halftime? There's like you get together and the coach, in those cases, I don't know what they do, but where you have kind of a recap of the experience, right?
Yeah.
That's the place, unlike in football where the coach is just yelling at you or whatever and telling you, where you actually have the players say, hey, this didn't work out because this happened.
Yeah, what we generally call that behavior is like tilt. And so in gaming, tilt is when you're thrown off your game. And so that's, even last night, again, League of Legends had a very hard game. They ended up winning, but it was a 2-1 series. And so after the first loss, it was literally like, let's take 5 minutes and do a breathing exercise. It seems really dumb, but like we did the breathing exercise and they were back in it, and then they win. Like, so there's
Instead of just grabbing a Mountain Dew.
Yeah, and there's a difference in that holistic approach of like, let's see what gets our mind back in it and focus back into play versus like keeping that mentality going, that native mentality. So did that answer your question, Jordan?
okay, so I know like the bell just rang.
Yeah.
So, but mostly for us, it's thinking about how do we create true representation. That's at the end of the day, right? So if we want to have diversity in games, we have to represent. So since we're trying to do that within our team, I'd like to start thinking, how do we do that when we build stuff too? How do we have true representation of the things that we're actually building? So what is a true representative of mental health or of a young woman or of a man or all these things? Because then if we can like see that, then people will actually like recognize that and actually feel more included. And for me, it's like figuring out using programs or using things that are just lower barriers to entry, right? Again, the equity side of things, trying to get people involved and wanting to be creators and then saying like, I can do this without feeling so intimidated, right? So one of the things that I had a student, and I won't show it, but it's because it's kind of long, but it's also a way to tell stories. So a lot of students have a lot of stories to tell that are really meaningful, especially ones that are hurtful. And gaming gives them a way to tell a story. And in particular, this story that I have here, that I'm happy to share, she said we could share. It talks about a really traumatic event that happened here on campus for her. But she was able to kind of work through some of that through this story. As well as this other one that's a project that I have a grad student and a couple of other older students working on, talking about housing insecurity, which is very prominent right now in Missoula, Montana. So what does that look like? And how do we represent those that are feeling invisible? How do we give them, shine a light on this very important issue and things like that? So these are the types of things, as well as being involved in organizations that actually promote this, right? So we've been involved with AnyKey for a long time, Extra Life for a long time, but all these other organizations that are out there that are also promoting some really great work for specific groups, but in an entirety, it actually then starts again giving visibility to people so they can feel like they can belong. So that's kind of the idea, is changing this conversation from just kind of what it's always been to like, how do we break those barriers? How do we start really thinking about what is it that we can do? Like, what I love about the school that I'm in is that we constantly are thinking like, well, what if we did this? Or what if we did that? And there's no real quote unquote rules. I mean, there's some, but not really, right? Because the idea is we want people to think like, what if we try this over here? This may or may not work, which kind of goes back into our growth potential, but we're going to try to do the right thing. So that's really it. So here's the references if you really care. Anyway, questions?
The last thing I have, it's always a fun thing. I feel like that I have. What was your gateway game? What was the game that you played that got you in the games? So
Viva Pinata.
Viva. Yeah.
Diablo.
Nice. Well, what was, I mean, there's a game that got you to play games, so.
Nice.
Such a great game. Mine was Mario teaches typing. And it led to, because my parents only wanted me to play like educational games, but then of course went out of control, started playing things like Diablo and stuff like that.
What came after Doom? There was one after that that was a little bit more sophisticated with the rocket launcher, you jump around and like castles and stuff. I played that game too. In the early days there, in the early 90s. Not Doom. I played Doom also.
Yeah, I played Doom. Played a lot of Mortal Kombat. That was a super popular one with my mom. She let me do it.
With like the pulling the.
I don't know that she even
Go
knew.
out of the neck.
Yeah, I don't think she knew